Today, we'll be exploring the sounds of comfort. Listen closely. That's the sound of you getting a complimentary hand massage at the nail salon. And that's the sound of your favorite bedroom fan, still spinning after 5 years. Now listen to the sound of a cold, creamy Starbucks mocha frappuccino drink. With deliciously satisfying flavors, Starbucks frappuccino drinks are comfort in a bottle.
It's time to have your high-five moment with High Five Casino, the top social casino where the action and real prizes never stop. Fun spins and big wins are right at your fingertips with over 1,000 games, including High Five Casino exclusives. High Five Casino is always free to play with free coins given out every 4 hours. Sign up today and get free welcome coins you can spin for a chance at cash prizes. Visit highfivecasino.com.
High Five Casino.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. Must be 21 years or older. Terms and conditions apply.
Today's episode contains very brief mentions of miscarriage and child death. So if you are sensitive to these topics, please listen at your own discretion.
What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna.
Before we begin, I want to clarify that in today's episode I will be referring to Madame de Pompadour by her birth name, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, until she is granted the title of Madame de Pompadour, after which point I will refer to her as Madame de Pompadour. Please note that in some quotes that I will share, she is also referred to as Madame d'Étiole and La Marquise, a French term for noblewoman. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part episode on Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, later known as Madame de Pompadour. In part 1, we explored Jeanne Antoinette's beginnings, her father's exile, her time at the convent, and the fortune-teller's prophecy that she would one day become the king's mistress. We then explored her marriage, her move to the estate of Étiole, her rise within Paris's social circles, and most importantly, the start of her romance with the king. We left things off in our story just after Jeanne Antoinette and the king established themselves as lovers, and the king made it clear that she was no passing fling. By April of 1745, just 2 months after their first rendezvous at the masked ball, Jeanne Antoinette was already carving her way towards the royal court. She soon made history as the first woman of bourgeoisie origins to become the official mistress to the king. As the Duke of Luynes wrote in a letter, "That which seemed doubtful a little while ago is almost a constant truth. They say that she is madly in love with the king, and that the passion is reciprocated." And what better way to publicly declare Jeanne Antoinette as the king's official mistress than a move to Versailles? In Versailles, Jeanne Antoinette was given a small bedroom, sitting room, and reception room. She could only reach her room by means of a chaise volante or flying chair, a set of pulleys that would hoist her above, saving her from having to take the main stairwell. But she did have a secret stairwell connecting her bedroom to the king's. The king often snuck away to spend hours canoodling with her. The two were so naturally compatible, it was as if their union was written in the stars. The king became more and more enamored with her each day, finding her elegant, charming, brilliant, and entertaining. Jeanne Antoinette began to spend many of her evenings with the king in his petit cabinet, a private section of the court that consisted of the king's own libraries, studies, and dining rooms reserved for his intimate circles. She was invited to the king's supper parties with his closest associates, and she made a favorable first impression on the king's circle. No one could deny her charm and beauty. As Barbier, a lawyer who met Jeanne Antoinette around this time, wrote, "This Madame d'Etial is well made and extremely pretty, sings perfectly and knows 100 amusing little songs, rides marvelously, and has had all the education possible." We can only imagine that Jeanne Antoinette was pinching herself at what had become her reality. She must have savored every moment of these early days. How did she feel as she went to bed at night, the private staircase to the king's lair, in the very room in which she slept, to dine with the most prestigious persons of all of France, to be living out the wildest dreams of her imagination? Once Jeanne Antoinette had established herself at Versailles, it was time to break the news to her husband. Her husband had been sent away on business in Provence, and had no clue that his wife had taken up with the king. It was Tournem who relayed the news. Her husband was so shocked that he fainted immediately. He wrote a desperate letter to Jeanne Antoinette, begging her to return to him and their family, but she swiftly filed for a formal separation. To ease his suffering, Tournem offered him a job as a general farber in Grenoble, to distance him from his new grim reality. Jeanne Antoinette also had to arrange for the care of her young daughter Alexandrine. One might judge Jeanne Antoinette for abandoning her daughter to pursue her life as the king's mistress, and it wouldn't be wrong. But a more sympathetic view would be to see it as one of the many sacrifices Jeanne Antoinette had to make to be by the king's side. Though she had to live separately from Alexandrine, Jeanne Antoinette always kept a watchful eye on her daughter and spent as much time with her as she could. Once her position as mistress was officially settled, Jeanne Antoinette had to dedicate herself to learning the ways of the court. The French court had its own specific codes of conduct, and as someone who was not raised within the court, its many rules and regulations were completely foreign to her. She spent that first summer back home at Etial, being tutored in all the intricacies of court etiquette. She had to learn how to walk like a lady of the court, which consisted of taking several tiny, quick steps, how to curtsy to royalty, how to powder and rouge her face, and the family histories of everyone at court, among hundreds of other details. Her tutor, the Abbé de Bernis, took charge of her education. He, like everyone else who came in contact with Jeanne Antoinette, was immediately charmed by her. He wrote to a friend, "Madame d'Etial had all the graces, all the freshness, and all the gaiety of youth. She danced, sang, played comedy. She lacked no agreeable talent. She liked literature and the arts. She had a lofty soul, sensitive and generous." Jeanne Antoinette's natural talents, open mind, and warm presence served her well during these months of training. Another person who was immediately charmed by Jeanne Antoinette was Voltaire. Having become acquainted through her salon, Voltaire was thrilled to hear that Jeanne Antoinette had struck up a romance with the king. He became a frequent visitor to Etial that summer, but his visits may not have been purely out of friendship. Notorious for his power-hungry ways, Voltaire must have seen in Jeanne Antoinette an opportunity to gain admission into the French court. He certainly seemed more than eager to excessively flatter her. Voltaire wrote to her in a letter that summer, "I interest myself in your happiness more than you think. Perhaps there is no one in Paris who takes a more lively interest. I am, with respect, madame, of your eyes, your figure, and your wit, a very humble and obedient servant." Voltaire was almost as good as Jean Antoinette herself at charming his way to powerful connections. But it wasn't just Voltaire who had something to gain from their friendship. Their relationship would soon prove to be mutually beneficial. Both outsiders and with far from royal backgrounds, they could help each other survive the cutthroat world of the court. Voltaire could help Jean Antoinette refine her literary skills, particularly her penmanship. He could also work as her personal PR agent, painting a positive image of her to the public. In return, Jean Antoinette could get Voltaire the king's ear. They would maintain a close friendship for many years to come. While Jean Antoinette was learning the ways of the court, the king was off to France's war front. They exchanged numerous love letters during their time apart, writing to each other several times a week. More than 80 letters arrived at Étiale from the king between the months of May and September alone. In one of these letters, sent on July 9th, the king notified Jean Antoinette of her new title. He cleverly broke the news by addressing the letter to Madame de Pompadour. Jean Antoinette would go by Madame de Pompadour for the rest of her life. How did Jean Antoinette, now Madame de Pompadour, feel as she opened the king's letter? Did she scream with excitement, do a victory dance, or rush to tell her closest supporters? Did the letter make her new reality all the more real? That she had managed to work her way from middle-class origins and receive an official title from the royal French court? How did she celebrate this pivotal moment in her life? Her new title meant that Madame de Pompadour could now be presented at court, a tradition typically reserved for members of nobility. When the king returned from war that September, Madame de Pompadour rode to meet him in Versailles in royal carriages. After spending the last few months familiarizing herself with the court and its many customs, she was confident that she would be able to win over the court's good graces, and she became determined to make friends with all members of the royal family, including the queen. The queen had long been a distant wife to the king. She had grown used to his infidelities, and the couple rarely even acknowledged each other. Though she did her court duties, the queen was otherwise isolated, and certainly did not involve herself with her husband's lovers. But Madame de Pompadour was no average lover. She insisted on meeting the queen and showering her with flattery. Though Madame de Pompadour and the queen were far from friends, the queen did appreciate that the king's new mistress was respectful and gave her cold nod of approval. Madame de Pompadour could charm even her lover's wife. A week later, Madame de Pompadour made her first public appearance with her new title. Parisian society had never before seen a woman of Madame de Pompadour's background not only become the king's mistress, but receive an official title from the court. One can only imagine that in these early days, Madame de Pompadour must have given the people of France hope. She certainly seemed to have captured their attention. A spectator of the event noted that Madame de Pompadour was very well made, magnificent skin, superb hands and arms, her eyes more pretty than large, but of a fire, a spirituality, a brilliancy that I have never seen in any other woman. But not everyone approved of Madame de Pompadour, and she did receive pushback, particularly from other members of the court. As the Duc de Choiseul wrote, "Such a presentation appeared monstrous, for it seemed that all the rules of polite society, of justice and of etiquette were being violated by carrying the wife of a farmer general in the middle of Paris, and after having her change her name, making her a woman of rank fit to be presented." These court members clearly weren't ready to break free of outdated tradition. Never one to shrink in the face of adversity, Madame de Pompadour shrugged off any disapproval. She wouldn't allow ill will to ruin her big moment. She began settling into her new life at court with confidence, putting on a smiling face for both friends and foes. One of her first ambitions at court was to take care of her family. She asked the king to give her father a property called Vendière and pushed for Tournem to be appointed as the head of Ministry of Works. She even began to train her younger brother to one day take over Tournem's position, funding his education. But there was one family member she sadly couldn't save: her mother Louise. By late autumn 1745, Louise became gravely ill with cancer. She tried to muster all her strength to stay alive so that she could continue to support her daughter. But that Christmas Eve, she passed away at only 46 years old. Louise, who had selflessly dedicated herself to Madame de Pompadour, was at least alive long enough to see her daughter's dreams come true. We can only imagine how devastating a blow her mother's death must have been for Madame de Pompadour. And to make matters worse, with her role at court still so new, she had to hide her grief from the public. Only in the privacy of her room could she mourn the loss of her dear mother. How did Madame de Pompadour spend these private moments? Did she cry herself to sleep, her pillows damp with tears? Did she write heartfelt letters to family to keep her mother's memory alive? Did she cradle herself through the darkest nights? We can only imagine how lonely Madame de Pompadour must have felt as she processed her mother's death. To make matters worse, the court was becoming more and more hostile against her. A slanderous poem was being passed around with the lines, "A little bourgeoisie, raised to be a slut, brings everything down to her level and makes the court a slum." The only place that she could escape the court's scornful eyes and forget her grief was in the king's petit cabinet. Here she could not only enjoy the king's company, but also his intimate gatherings of friends. Already a seasoned hostess from her days running her salon, Madame de Pompadour helped the king create a warm and inviting environment for his guests. And with a natural gift for singing and acting, she also loved performing on these evenings. She had a vibrant energy and a wonderful sense of humor that made everyone feel comfortable in her presence. A visitor of the Petit Cabinet wrote of his experience. One went up to the Petit Cabinet by the staircase behind the salon and gathered before supper in the little gallery. The king was cheerful, at ease, but always with an air of grandeur, which one could not ignore. He seemed very much in love with Madame de Pompadour. We were 2 hours at a table, 18 of us, all the most relaxed with no excess. At last the king went into the petit salon. He heated and made himself coffee, for there were no servants. He said to her quietly, "Allons, let's go to bed." We all went down Madame de Pompadour's little staircase. As time went on, the king depended more and more on Madame de Pompadour for his entertainment, and she began to play an irreplaceable role in his private life. Soon enough, Madame de Pompadour fully settled into her new life at court. In the spring of 1746, she became pregnant with the king's child. The king, who had to depart for battle, bought Madame de Pompadour her own private chateau, where she could rest and tend to herself through pregnancy. But instead of relaxing, Madame de Pompadour busied herself with decorating the chateau, working to near exhaustion. Tragically, she miscarried just a few months into the pregnancy. Though she was not mother to the king's child, she soon did become mother of the arts. One of her first agendas at court was to beautify her surroundings with art of all mediums. She began to commission works by the best artists of France and became directly involved with their careers. With carte blanche from the king, Madame de Pompadour had a bottomless budget to support the arts. She had a soft spot for fine china and became particularly invested in the production of porcelain. The king gave Madame de Pompadour her own village, named Sèvres, to build a porcelain factory. The factory at Sèvres proved to be immensely successful. Many of the greatest craftsmen, artists, and sculptors of her day worked there. Sèvres porcelain was incredibly unique, with specialized shapes and colors. In fact, they even invented a color, appropriately called Rose Pompadour, to honor the factory's matriarch. Madame de Pompadour would maintain a watchful eye over the factory through her life. It was arguably her greatest achievement and remained a highly profitable asset for France for decades to come. Madame de Pompadour was also very interested in engraving, and not just the production of it. She invited one of the best engravers in the country to teach her how to engrave stones. A few of her own engraved stones exist today. One, an engraved sardonyx with an image of victory, personified by her own self-portrait. She also learned how to make etchings, taught by Boucher. Today, a total of 52 of her own etchings survive. A true Renaissance woman, Madame de Pompadour was an avid book collector as well. In her early days at Versailles, she began to build what would become a very impressive collection of antique volumes. She even hired her own personal librarian to catalog all of her books. In total, she acquired over 3,500 volumes. And she didn't just collect these books as antique items or decor. Their well-worn covers proved that she actually read them too. Though her books were sold shortly after her death, the full catalog of her collection does exist today. Clearly a lover of the written word, Madame de Pompadour also rallied behind the encyclopedia being published in France. She firmly believed that people had a right to a collection of accessible information. Though most of the court were against it, and she was still an early addition to the royal community, Madame de Pompadour doubled down on her stance. Perhaps due to her middle-class origins or her passion for books, she understood how essential a tool the encyclopedia was for the public's education. Though in her later years she would rescind her support, her bravery in being the sole supporter of such an important literary work should not be overlooked. And then, of course, there are the many architectural projects she designed, decorated, and mobilized behind. Madame de Pompadour loved nothing more than to acquire houses, design their renovation, furnish and decorate their rooms with her refined taste, and then move on to the next building project. The first house Madame de Pompadour designed was a small private chateau called Crécy. The king purchased the chateau and surrounding area for her, relocating 2 entire villages to make room for the estate. Located in northern France, overlooking the Blaise River, Madame de Pompadour renovated Crécy into a wondrous chateau with a large terrace. Madame de Pompadour then took to sprucing up Versailles. In its gardens, she built a hermitage, or little pavilion. The hermitage became a safe haven for Madame de Pompadour. She wrote to a friend, "The hermitage is 16 yards by 10, so you can judge how grand it must be. But I can be there alone, or with the king and a few others, so I am happy." She and the king would often retreat there, where they gardened, and they even raised doves and chickens in coops. We can imagine the hermitage provided the rare opportunity for Madame de Pompadour and the king to play house, giving themselves the fantasy of a simple life together. After the success of the hermitage at Versailles, she also had one built at Fontainebleau. Here as well, Madame de Pompadour and the king relished in their privacy. Madame de Pompadour preferred to stay in her little hermitage over her spacious rooms, and the king made any excuse to join her. On some evenings, they even cooked themselves supper. We can only imagine how much Madame de Pompadour and the king savored these moments together. The Hermitage at Fontainebleau is one of the few surviving structures designed by Madame de Pompadour that survive today. But Madame de Pompadour's greatest architectural achievement was called Bellevue, the only home in which she designed and built from scratch. Though Bellevue sadly does not survive, there are enough existent drawings for us to appreciate its grandeur scale and breathtaking beauty. Bellevue was just outside of Paris, with the city's domes and churches in its view. The house consisted of 2 wings, a courtyard which held a theater, vast gardens, and even a bathing suite for Madame de Pompadour and the king to enjoy in private. One entered Bellevue through an impressive vestibule. The floors were made of black and white marble, which led to a grand staircase. 2 statues adorned the front entrance, one of an allegory of poetry, the other an allegory of music, both modeled by Madame de Pompadour herself. From the vestibule, one entered a grand salon filled with porcelain vases. To the left, Madame de Pompadour had her own suite with a luxurious bedroom. Her bedroom had an oriental theme with Turkish decor. On its walls hung a painting by artist Charles Van Loo titled The Sultan, which included a portrait of Madame de Pompadour in Turkish costume. But arguably the most impressive area of the house was the gallery. Bellevue's gallery highlighted Madame de Pompadour's power as patron and included works by the most distinguished artists of her day. Paintings by Boucher and Van Loo, sculptures by Pigalle and Falconet, and frescoes by the Brunetti brothers. For Madame de Pompadour, Bellevue was a place for the best of French art and craftsmanship to be on display. Back at Versailles, she would also bring attention to the arts. In 1747, Madame de Pompadour established the Petit Cabinet's very own theater, hiring her own company of performers to entertain the king and his circle. Madame de Pompadour starred in many of these productions herself, never resisting a moment in the spotlight. Those lucky enough to see Madame de Pompadour perform gave her glowing reviews, and her biggest fan remained the king, who kissed her openly after each performance. The theater was a massive success, and even the queen attended. Over the years, the theater grew to contain several rows, boxes, and balconies, which held large audiences. The theater ran for 5 consecutive years, put on over 100 different performances. Madame de Pompadour was quickly earning herself an important place at court, and the king was becoming more and more dependent on her for every facet of his life. Visitors at Versailles noted that the king seemed to be at the feet of Madame de Pompadour and abandoned himself completely to his love for Madame de Pompadour. Another reported, Madame de Pompadour is playing a great part at court. The suggestions that she made to the king in order to fix his choice. The Marquise has an excellent character. The king turned to Madame de Pompadour to take charge of his social obligations, and he did not make any new friends without her approval. Soon, eager courtiers hoping to get the king's ear lined up to speak with her. They knew that the only way to the king was through her. She began to receive endless requests and decided who would have access to the king. There was no denying that Madame de Pompadour was swiftly taking control. There were now 2 queens at Versailles, and one wasn't married to the king. One of the best ways for courtiers to relay their requests to Madame de Pompadour was by attending her toilette. Her toilette routine became an almost ceremony-like event, where spectators watched her gracefully put on her makeup. She received men from ambassadors to princes, who dutifully watched her as they anxiously asked for favors. Madame de Pompadour always received these men kindly. As one of these men described, "She was at her toilette, and one could not be prettier. In addition, she was very amusing and entertaining, and the king seemed to love her more than all the others, and he was right. As a mistress, she was the most pleasant, and so there she was, in a very declared position. There's something quite comical to imagine these important men clamoring to speak with Madame de Pompadour as she slowly dressed her face in makeup, perhaps taking secret pleasure in their desperation. But her days at court were not all sunshine and rainbows, and there were many challenges that Madame de Pompadour had to face. To start, her lifestyle began to have major health implications. She exhausted herself with all of her busy work and unsustainable schedule. As a friend of hers wrote, "She cannot stand up to the life she is leading, with its late nights, occupations, spectacles, continual expenses to amuse the king, whereas she herself, moreover, is without cease, occupied with activities and in the middle of continual whirlwind of people." And she herself admitted to a friend, "The life I lead is terrible. I have scarcely a minute to myself. Rehearsals and performances, travel twice a week, if it is possible to breathe." She would get violent headaches and become bedridden for weeks at a time. By 1748, she needed a doctor in constant attendance. And her ostentatious habits were beginning to cause mass unrest within the French public. Her architectural projects cost a fortune, and now that Bellevue could be seen from Paris, the public knew firsthand just how garish these projects were. They also criticized her and the king for being more concerned with their performances at the Petit Cabinet than the needs of the French people. And they weren't wrong. In January of 1749, while Madame de Pompadour was performing on stage at Versailles, a huge riot took place in Paris, leaving over 200 dead. Pamphlets began spreading like wildfire all over Paris, condemning Madame de Pompadour as careless and selfish. When she traveled to the city, people would cover her carriage in mud. And on one occasion, her presence at a theater caused such an uproar that she had to be escorted out the back door. Eventually, Madame de Pompadour stopped going into Paris altogether. She worried that the king might blame her for tarnishing his reputation. He was being slammed for being dominated by his own mistress. Madame de Pompadour knew that she had to keep the king distracted from the public's noise, and to make him more and more dependent on her. To solidify her position at court, in 1750, Madame de Pompadour requested a grander suite at Versailles, on the ground floor, typically reserved for the royal family only. This suite had a reception room, salon, dressing room, study, and a spacious bedroom. The move made clear that Madame de Pompadour was here to stay, regardless of the public's opinion. This suite would serve as her headquarters as she became more and more powerful at court. Madame de Pompadour also knew that to solidify her position at court, she had to accept that she was outgrowing her role as mistress. After 5 years as the king's mistress, she could barely keep up with the king's insatiable sexual appetite. She became exhausted and at times even unwell, trying to please him. Madame de Pompadour admitted to a close friend, "The fact is, my dearest, that I'm terrified of not pleasing the king anymore and of losing him. You know men attach a great deal of importance to certain things, and I, unfortunately for me, am very cold by nature." Madame de Pompadour had to recalibrate her relationship with the king. If their physical intimacy was dwindling, then she had to make sure their emotional intimacy was all the stronger. She decided that a shift from lover to friend would maintain both their bond and her position, but relieve her of her duties as mistress. She had always relied more on her ability to entertain and manage projects to keep the king content anyway, so her decision seemed only but natural. But she also understood the constraints of being a woman at court. Only men could inherit the throne, and women primarily wielded their power through their relationship to men. Having entered the court as a mistress, she knew she now had to adapt, so that her value came more from the seriousness of her mind and the magnitude of her accomplishments than her sexual appeal. As a court member named Croy wrote, "Her plan, which I have anticipated for some years, is to win over the king's mind and spirit." By the end of 1750, Madame de Pompadour officially announced her transition from the king's lover to close friend. The king, who still loved her dearly, accepted her decision without pushback. To mark this transition, Madame de Pompadour commissioned Jean-Baptiste Pigalle to sculpt a portrait of her, masked as the allegory of friendship. In the sculpture, we see a half-bare Madame de Pompadour, reaching her hand out in a gesture of friendship. With her other hand, she holds her heart, a reminder of her everlasting love for the king. She is suspended in forward motion, her foot gracefully stepping onward, as she herself enters this new stage in both her relationship with the king and her life at large. She also commissioned Boucher to paint her portrait. Though the original painting is lost, an oil sketch remains. Here we see Madame de Pompadour standing regally in a silk dress with roses pinned to her right shoulder. Her hand grazes a harpsichord as if she is just about to play us a tune. At her feet is a large bounded volume with her own coat of arms stamped on its cover. To its right, a globe and sizable roll of architectural plans. Though Madame de Pompadour is still very beautiful, the emphasis here is on her mind rather than her looks. She is every inch a cultivated woman, achieved in music, literature, philosophy, and art. She proudly announces her new role as friend and advisor, and makes clear that she's more than qualified for the job. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease and a whole lot of love, you transform 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. LED headlights, spoilers, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it at affordable prices. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride every time. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
It's time to have your high five moment with High Five Casino, the top social casino where the action and real prizes never stop. Fun spins and big wins are right at your fingertips with over 1,000 games, including High Five Casino exclusives. High Five Casino is always free to play with free coins given out every 4 hours. Sign up today for a free welcome offer that can get you spinning and winning right away. Visit highfivecasino.com.
High Five Casino.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. Must be 21 years or older. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. The shift from mistress to trusted friend was also Madame de Pompadour's first step towards becoming the king's advisor. No longer tied down with her duties as lover, Madame de Pompadour could lend her ear to the king and advise him on politics. As the Comte de Stanville wrote, she had the courage to take part in political affairs and was soon well informed in them because she had a lively and accurate mind. She gave the king advice, and it was rare that it was not judicious. King Louis XV acquired the habit of letting himself be guided by her advice. And thus was the start of Madame de Pompadour's political career. By the 1750s, she became the king's unofficial political advisor. Just like she had taken charge of the king's entertainment in her early days at court, she now saw the opportunity to manage his political duties, which burdened rather than interested the king. A Prussian representative noted that Madame de Pompadour must be delighted at being able to impress the king by developing talents he had not thought her capable of until now. Behold, she thus took cognizance of the most important matters. Though the king may have been surprised by Madame de Pompadour's political savviness, she herself had no doubt that she would become an irreplaceable asset to the king as advisor, confidant, and advocate. Her new position as friend and advisor called for a new title at court. On October 12, 1751, the king announced that Madame de Pompadour was being given the prestigious rank of Duchess. Being named a Duchess was an immense honor and awarded Madame de Pompadour the ability to sit with the king and queen in all public ceremonies. Though they were no longer lovers, the title signified the king's continued respect for her and that her influence at court was only growing. This was important because as she aged, she no longer had her good looks to lean on. Her title as Duchess solidified this new stage in her life, one more focused on her political endeavors and maintaining her position at court, rather than keeping the king sexually satisfied. For the king's sexual appetite did not abate after Madame de Pompadour stepped down as mistress. To keep his love life discreet, and to be sure that none of his new mistresses could threaten her, the king and Madame de Pompadour made a deal regarding his lovers. The king would turn to young girls of lower-class origins and with no influential connections of their own to placate his sexual needs. He would bring these girls to a private room, dubbed the birdcage because of the young birds he would take there. The king was satisfied, and Madame de Pompadour could tolerate his affairs, since they were no threat to her. As she wrote to a friend, "It is his heart that I want. All these little girls with no education will not take it from me." But the king's affairs did inevitably strain their relationship. The king no longer looked at Madame de Pompadour with the same adoration in his eyes. She had to turn to intimidation to get the king to meet her demands. Though he was the king of France, it was Madame de Pompadour who took clear charge of their relationship, and she would turn to intimidation tactics to quell the growing unpopularity amongst the French public as well. She was aware that she had developed an infamous reputation for wasting France's money on her own personal endeavors. Instead of changing her behavior, she cracked down on her enemies. As author Nancy Milford wrote, after almost 5 years at court, she was harder and more cynical, wary and suspicious of those who surrounded her, ready to use her weapons at hand to remove a foe, and absolutely determined to maintain her position. It was around this time that Madame de Pompadour made a secret alliance with the head of Paris's police. He would keep her informed on any threats, and together they would take action. She particularly punished those guilty of spreading slander about her. As she wrote in a letter, "I believe it is very essential to punish, and very severely, the authors of such mischief, for one must make an example of these infamous villains." Those convicted of distributing libelous material were punished severely, many receiving life sentences in Paris's toughest prison, Bastille. Madame de Pompadour would let nothing and no one threaten her position at court. She convinced herself that the king needed her, and more so that France needed her. At Versailles, she took stock of who she could trust, being sure to appoint them to prominent positions, and swiftly removed any enemies. As the Comte d'Argenson sarcastically wrote to his brother, "The mistress is prime minister and becoming more and more despotic. such as a favorite has never been in France. She believes herself the queen. Of course, Madame de Pompadour was not officially prime minister or queen, but she certainly acted as such. But no amount of power could protect Madame de Pompadour from personal tragedy. In 1754, her only child, Alexandrine, was living at a convent in Paris, where she was receiving an early education. Madame de Pompadour was preparing Alexandrine for a bright future and referred to her as her little princess. But on June 14th, Alexandrine became concerningly ill. The nuns sent Madame de Pompadour a haste letter delivering the bad news. When the letter arrived, she rushed towards Paris, and the king even sent his own personal doctors. But on her route, Madame de Pompadour got word that Alexandrine had already passed away. She was only 10 years old. How did Madame de Pompadour feel upon receiving the devastating news that her only daughter had died? That she couldn't even say goodbye to her little princess? Did she feel guilty for abandoning Alexandrine for her life at court? Did she feel that she had failed as a mother? To make matters worse, Madame de Pompadour's father, who was very close to Alexandrine, was so heartbroken over the news of his granddaughter's death that he died just 11 days later. Madame de Pompadour lost her father and daughter less than 2 weeks apart. She must have felt that the ground was quickly crumbling beneath her feet, and her anguish unimaginable. And yet, Madame de Pompadour could not risk her powerful visage by showing her grief outwardly. The Duc de Croy, who visited Madame de Pompadour 6 weeks after Alexandrine's death, wrote, "I saw her for the first time since the death of her daughter, a terrible blow, from which I thought she would be devastated. But as too much grief would have done harm to her looks and perhaps even weakened her position at court, I found her neither changed nor downcast, and by one of those miracles at court which are frequent to this king, I found her no less dashing, nor affecting any more serious air. And yet she has been deeply shaken, and she was in all likelihood as unhappy inside as she seemed happy out." Even the loss of her daughter didn't stop Madame de Pompadour from climbing the ranks at court. With each year, she became more and more politically involved and powerful. In time, she became the unofficial diplomat for the French court and forged a close alliance with Austria. The Austrian diplomat wrote that Madame de Pompadour had excellent qualities of mind and heart. The minister informs her of everything that they have to say to the king. It is the king himself who requires it. She has one quality which renders her fit for great affairs, that of impenetrable discretion. That is how she has gained the king's confidence. She began to speak on the king's behalf, no matter how great the matter, and Europe's most powerful leaders came to see her at Versailles. As the Comte de Saint-Priest noted, it was Madame de Pompadour who was all-powerful, without contradiction, who plays the leading role at Versailles. Not from authority, but from influence. Every favor came from the favorite. She received not only the homage of courtiers, but also those of the princes themselves. Imagining Madame de Pompadour, not only a woman, but one without any royal blood, meeting with ambassadors and princes to discuss matters of the utmost importance, is exhilarating. As her power grew, her prestigious titles accumulated. In February of 1756, the king named Madame de Pompadour a lady-in-waiting to the queen. Historically, there had always been 12 such ladies, and yet Madame de Pompadour once again broke convention and became the 13th. A lady-in-waiting was the most prestigious title a woman could receive in court, short of the queen herself. The announcement left court members shocked, but none were as stunned as the queen, who had no other choice but to begrudgingly accept the king's decision. The title was not only the highest honor Madame de Pompadour could receive, but made her utterly untouchable. By the age of 35, Madame de Pompadour had garnered several titles, become a lady-in-waiting to the queen, and was the king's representative in his political affairs. To celebrate her momentous achievements, she commissioned Boucher to paint a series of official portraits. She was ready for her close-up on canvas, and to be celebrated as the cultivated and powerful woman she had become. Boucher painted 9 separate portraits, though in today's episode we'll only explore a few. These portraits are nothing short of dazzling, and like Madame de Pompadour herself, embody the magic of the Rococo period. In the most famous of these portraits, painted in 1756, we see Madame de Pompadour at age 35. She wears her ceremonial robes, elaborately decorated with luscious pink bows and delicate flowers. She reclines in a lavish chaise lounge, her right elbow gracefully propping up her body. She holds an open book, reminding us of her ever-active mind, which is only further emphasized by the ornate bookshelf in the background. Scattered on the floor are sheets of music, signaling her musical talents, and drawing utensils, a rare insight into her personal artistic practice. To her right is a rosewood writing desk and a fluffed quill pen poking from the open drawer, ready to be plucked. At her feet is a small black dog, her faithful companion in her later years. Here, Madame de Pompadour is every inch an educated and refined woman, proud of her accomplishments and effortlessly confident in her position. Painted the following year, we find Madame de Pompadour again in Pompadour at her toilette. Here we see her at her famous toilette, gracefully applying her blush with a miniature brush. On her wrist is a coral cameo, which one wonders if she engraved herself. She wears a regal lace cape, which ties around her neck with her signature pink bow. She looks at the viewer curiously, luring us in with her whirling gray eyes. In this work, Boucher sets the scene for us to join the long line of ambassadors and princes, nervously waiting to greet Madame de Pompadour's perfectly rouged face. And finally, painted in 1759, we find Madame de Pompadour in perhaps her most splendid portrait yet, standing proudly in the gardens she designed herself at Bellevue. Madame de Pompadour stares at us coyly, tempting us to join her. We can almost smell the fresh scent of roses and feel the refreshing breeze around her. She wears a gorgeous pink lace dress with impressive ruffles around her sleeves. Behind her is one of the many statues she commissioned to beautify her gardens. To her side is one of her pet spaniels, this one named Innes, who stares adoringly up at her. Here, Madame de Pompadour invites us into a wondrous world of her own making, and smiles because she knows it's a gorgeous world indeed. Though her portraits in these later years paint a glamorous image, Madame de Pompadour's life had actually taken a dark turn. With her growing political influence, she became more and more involved with international affairs. But as intelligent as she was, Madame de Pompadour was not at all prepared for what was on the horizon. In 1755, she was approached by the Austrian diplomat to intervene in negotiations with the British. Because she had always had good relations with Austria, she obliged. This intervention pitted France and Austria against Britain and Prussia in what would become the 7 Years' War. Madame de Pompadour played an essential role in leading France's war efforts. She frequently met with generals, often on the behalf of the king, and nothing was decided without her approval. While the king went on long hunting escapades or escaped off to his birdcage for affairs with his young lovers, Madame de Pompadour met with ministers twice a day, with daily updates from the war front. In 1759, she was more in command than ever, her hand in everything, all the ministers working with her, as the Duc de Croix wrote. At first, the French were victorious over Britain, and Madame de Pompadour even joked that their leading general takes a town in the same light-hearted way as he seduces a woman. But her jokes would soon turn to tears. France began to suffer humiliating defeats. Over the course of the war, the island of Guadeloupe, where France manned over 300 plantations producing important commodities such as coffee and sugar, fell to Britain, as did Senegal, India, and Canada. Madame de Pompadour took much of the blame, and she became consumed with attempts for retaliation. Overcome with guilt, she suffered sleepless nights, fevers, constant colds, and exhaustion. As she received news of devastating battle after devastating battle, she desperately wrote to a friend, "I am miserable. Is it possible to suffer more? What has become of our nation? I am 1,000 times more frightened of our humiliation than I would have been by the loss of the whole fleet." Madame de Pompadour isolated herself in her room, retreating from public view, and often cried herself to sleep. In desperate attempts to salvage France's dignity, Madame de Pompadour replaced France's generals with her close confidants she could trust. But they proved to be even more incompetent. France's funds became completely depleted, and they couldn't even afford sailors and ships for their navy. Madame de Pompadour wanted nothing more than peace. She was exhausted by what felt like endless war and loss. Finally, on November 3, 1762, a peace treaty was signed at Fontainebleau. Though peace was very much needed, the treaty was not very favorable for France. Able to recover Guadeloupe, France had to give up Canada, India, Senegal, and even the Ohio Valley to the British. Madame de Pompadour organized a large winter ball to celebrate the return of peace, but there was little to celebrate. The French public were embittered over the war and France's massive concessions, which they held Madame de Pompadour responsible for. As a result, her health worsened significantly, and she suffered from heart palpitations, loss of sight, and continuous fevers. But worse than this, her mental health was at an all-time low. She became engulfed in overwhelming sadness. Her mood darkened, and she indulged in fits of anger and turmoil. As a close friend of hers wrote, "She told me, in dramatic terms, how terribly she was affected by the deplorable state of the kingdom. She seemed to me furious and demented. It was a real sermon on the miseries which ambition brings in its train. She seemed so wretched, so proud, so violently shaken, and so suffocated by her own enormous power that I came away from an hour's talk feeling that death was the only refuge left to her." We see Madame de Pompadour around this time in her final portrait, Madame de Pompadour at her timbre frame, painted by François Hubert Drouet in 1763. Madame de Pompadour would pass away just a few months later. Here she sits, clearly aged, with grayed hair and a double chin, framed by a mature lace cap. She stares back at us pleasantly, masking her inner torment with an air of confidence. She wears an elegant silk dress decorated with hand-painted flowers. One of her pet spaniels stretches upwards as if he is just about to leap on her lap. Again, she showcases her ever-active mind, with a golden gilded bookshelf and an ornate writing desk to her right. She sits at her embroidery table, which at first glance seems like an innocent matronly pastime, but she was actually known to hold her political meetings during her embroidery sessions. She may be aged, but Madame de Pompadour doesn't want us to forget that she is still all-powerful. In her final days, Madame de Pompadour welcomed a special visitor at Versailles. In December of 1763, an 8-year-old music prodigy named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart played the organ at the king's supper. Always a lover of music, we can only imagine that Madame de Pompadour was overcome with a much-needed sense of peace as she listened to the young boy play. While Mozart had his whole life ahead of him, Madame de Pompadour's life was coming to an end. Just a few days after his visit, Madame de Pompadour fell gravely ill while at Choisy. Her breathing became labored, and she developed a high fever. She remained on bed rest for the next 3 months, surrounded by her beloved works of art that she had commissioned through her lifetime. The king came to visit her every single day and became heartsick over the thought of losing her. By March of 1764, she seemed to be at death's door, and the king prepared himself for the greatest loss of his life. Yet by some miracle, Madame de Pompadour recovered, seemingly well enough to travel back to Versailles. But death seemed to be toying with her. Along the journey, she was hit by unexpected cold and rainy weather and developed pneumonia. By the time she arrived at Versailles, she was in an extremely poor state. The king continued to visit Madame de Pompadour every day. He wrote in a letter to his son-in-law, "My anxieties have not lessened at all, and I admit to you that I have very little hope of a perfect recovery for her, and a great deal of fear that an end is perhaps too near. A relationship of almost 20 years and a solid friendship. But God is a master, and one must cede to everything he wishes." By April, the doctors had also given up hope on her recovery. She could no longer breathe lying down, so doctors propped her up in a chair as she took labored breaths. Those privileged enough to be with her during her final days were taken by her immense courage as she faced her life's end. The Dauphine noted, "She is dying with a courage rare in either sex. Every time she breathes, she believes it's for the last time. It is one of the most painful ways to die, and one of the cruelest one can imagine." The king knew it was time to read Madame de Pompadour her last rites. On the morning of her death, she asked that her will also be read out loud. In the will, she assigned guardians for her many pets, including her beloved spaniels, parrot, and even a pet monkey. She also asked that money be set aside for the psychic who had correctly predicted her future many years ago. Barely breathing, she turned to the king and whispered, "It is coming. Leave me to my soul, my confessor, and my women." How did Madame de Pompadour feel as she approached death's door? Was she proud of her accomplishments? Did she have any regrets? Did she feel that she had failed the French people, the king, herself? Or did she die overcome with a sense of peace, that she had always done her very best? At 7:30 p.m. on April 15th, Palm Sunday, Madame de Pompadour passed away at the age of 42. As the English ambassador recorded, Madame de Pompadour expired after a tedious illness. She saw the approaches of death with great courage, bid adieu to her friends with tenderness, and I think is generally regretted. She was buried in the crypt of the Capucine convent in Paris, alongside her mother and daughter. Her many belongings were removed from all the royal palaces and placed in storage in Paris. She had so many possessions that they had to rent 3 huge townhouses to store it all, and it took them over a year to make an inventory. Tributes for Madame de Pompadour began pouring in. Voltaire publicly thanked her for all she had done to help a great number of writers and artists. He declared it a tragedy that a beautiful woman should die at 40 while in the midst of the most dazzling career in the world. But not all tributes were positive. Famed French philosopher Diderot wrote, "What remains of that woman who exhausted us of men and money, left us without honor and without energy, and who has overturned the political system of Europe?" Today, only traces of her important life survive. Her first set of rooms at Versailles have been preserved, but sadly nothing remains of her impressive architectural feats such as Crécy and Bellevue. Her collection of engraved stones are now part of France's National Library, and more recently, a leather portfolio containing Madame de Pompadour's own etchings has been discovered at the Walters Art Museum, where they held an exhibition centered on Madame de Pompadour in 2016. Contemporary opinions on Madame de Pompadour as a historical figure remain mixed. Some admire her for her groundbreaking career at court, while others write her off as a power-hungry narcissist. Yet there is no denying her remarkable achievements. She not only fulfilled her impossible destiny by becoming the first woman of middle-class origins to be the king's mistress, she worked her way up the royal court until she was one of, if not the most powerful woman in all of France. As art historian Susan Wagner put it, what's really remarkable is that she still remained at court in the position of official mistress for the rest of her life, even though there was no longer a sexual relationship. From her beginning days at court, Madame de Pompadour had a unique ability to read the king's needs and make him dependent on her to meet them. As their romantic relationship diminished, she shifted her service to become the king's trustworthy friend and advisor. She met with Europe's most powerful ambassadors and leaders who understood that she had complete influence over the king. By the time France entered the 7 Years' War, Madame de Pompadour had almost entirely taken charge and had a political authority that no woman ever had before or would ever have again in the French royal court. Her political efforts rival her cultural ones. Madame de Pompadour was an extremely intelligent, cultured, and talented woman who not only had an immense interest in the cultivation of the arts, but also directly participated in them. She was an accomplished singer and actress, made her own etchings and engravings, designed impressive architectural projects, oversaw her own porcelain factory, and was an avid book collector and reader. And of course, she was a prominent patron of the arts, supporting the biggest artists of her day through commissions, and moreover, her belief in their talent. As scholar Nancy Milford eloquently put it, she had all the gifts of a great amateur: perfect taste, tireless energy in searching for perfection, and an intuitive understanding of the creative temperament which enabled her to make an artist do better than his best, and to impose her own ideas on him without hurting his feelings. It was largely due to Madame de Pompadour's artistic endeavors that France became a leading cultural capital in the world. Madame de Pompadour was certainly not without fault. Her abandonment of her husband and daughter to pursue her life at court was devastating to her family. She could be calculated, cold, self-centered, and ruthless. Many of her decisions made during the 7 Years' War turned disastrous for France and cost the country much of its empire. And her expensive lifestyle, the extravagant houses, the costly parties, and need for excessive opulence set the stage for the growing public unrest that would lead to the French Revolution, just 25 years after her death. Although a huge contributing factor to the revolution's cause, Madame de Pompadour was one of the last of her generation to enjoy the glamour of the French royal court and die a quiet and dignified death. Louis XV's next mistress, Madame du Barry, would die under the guillotine. Even with her faults, I cannot help but wonder if some of Madame de Pompadour's criticism stems from the age-old misogyny that many powerful women face. Her world wasn't ready for a woman with such influence, and we have to ask ourselves how far we've come today. Madame de Pompadour was a woman who knew what she wanted and fought fearlessly to achieve her wildest of dreams. I end today's episode with a quote from scholar Christine Pivette-Algrand. Madame de Pompadour was her own greatest creation. It was Louis XV who turned Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson into Madame le Marquise de Pompadour. But it was Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson who made Madame de Pompadour the dazzling personage known to history. I hope you have enjoyed ArtMuse's two-part episode on Madame de Pompadour. I've included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.
It's time to have your high five moment with High Five Casino, the top social casino where the action and real prizes never stop. Fun spins and big wins are right at your fingertips with over 1,000 games, including High Five Casino exclusives. High Five Casino is always free to play with free coins given out every 4 hours. Sign up today and get free welcome coins you can spin for a chance at cash prizes. Visit highfivecasino.com.
High Five Casino.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. Must be 21 years or older. Terms and conditions apply.